everybody. We're about to get started. I'm Dominique Quarles, and I serve as the doctoral intern for the Department of Student Affairs Assessment here at the University of Georgia. So that you all are joining us in our How College Students Learn session presented by Dr. C. Edward Watson. You all have questions throughout the presentation using the chat function. However, we ask that you mute your speakers on your phone and your computer to avoid interrupting the presentation. Please test the chat box located at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen by typing in your name to ensure that it is working properly. Located on the bottom right-hand corner, you can go to the top of your screen. There should be a down menu, and press in the participant icon, and you can see the screens. Okay. This session is recorded, so if you all would like to do it at a later time, we will give you that information. Thank you for your cooperation. Now, the speaker. The director for the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Georgia, where he leads university efforts associated with faculty development, TA development, learning technologies, instruction media, classroom support, and learning cases. He is the executive editor for the International Journal of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, and he is founding executive editor for the International Journal of Eat Portfolio. On active learning and exemplary teaching practices in traditional as well as technological enriching settings. Dr.
Hey, can you hear me?
Now.
Muted. Right. Let's try this again. Okay. I assume everyone can hear me now. I'm still chats coming through. I'm just getting chats from Ann, so maybe if there are questions, they can be repeated by Ann in the chat window. But so, yeah, the topic today, how college students learn. So as I thought about putting together this talk and what I might share, and I thought about talking about learning theory or trends regarding teaching and learning in higher education. But what I decided to do was just focus very specifically on several things that I can say with a high degree of confidence that are going to be truths about how college students learn. So that's really going to be the focus. I've put together a list of 11 things to share with you, not just 10, but one more, one extra to help you this. To talking about truth, sort of interspersed is going to be some breaking down of some myths that are out there regarding teaching and learning. So thinking specifically about myths, they're about journals that cover the higher education, teaching and learning realm. So just that sort of domain of learning, looking at just higher education, there's over 600 journals. So you can kind of find published articles that support a lot of different perspectives, but of course they're journals with varying degrees of, efficacy, if you will. So let's look at what we know empirically about learning and break down some of those myths. And through this, what I'd like for you to do, kind of your role, certainly you can pose questions, but as we end, I'm going to ask you specifically about how these truths impact you in student affairs, so your work in student affairs. Do these truths suggest anything for your practice? Is there anything that you might do differently when you come to work tomorrow or after Thanksgiving that might be informed by what I'm sharing here? So that would be the focus. So 11 things we know about learning and cognition, and before we get started, what I'd like for you to do is note this web address. I've got a one-page handout that is located at eddiewatson.net/11, the number 11 for 11 things, 11 PDF. And so I'll just chat here for the next minute or so to give you a chance to make it to that particular website. It's just a one-page file. It'll download real quickly. But what you'll find in this PDF file are the 11 truths that I'm getting ready to share with you, along with citations for every one. So kind of get back to the article or the research that supports that particular takeaway regarding teaching and learning. You can certainly do so. So all of my slides will have the citations at the bottom, but rather than trying to frantically take notes as I go through this, it might just be best to have a full page handout. So with that said, hopefully everyone's got the file or knows how to get to the file. After this, if they'd like, I'm going to begin what we know about teaching and learning. Questions before I get started? Great. As I'm speaking with unbelievable clarity today. That's a good surprise. Number one thing, where would I start if I would talk about how people learn and about teaching and what you can do to kind of structure learning environments to help people learn? The one thing that I would kind of put out there is this idea of prior knowledge. There's a educational psychology, it was kind of a textbook that was published back in the late 60s by a guy named Ausubel. And he said that all of teaching and learning can be distilled down to one principle. And you should find out what your students know, what's their prior knowledge in the area, find out, and then teach accordingly. As a couple of examples of why that's important, imagine if you come into a freshman level course, and that course, if the professor starts at a very high level, you lost from the very beginning of class, and so your interest diminishes, your motivation diminishes, your engagement diminishes, and you're likely to drop the class. If you show up in class and then you're going over stuff that you know quite well, then you're not going to be engaged or so some learning theorists have described the idea of pleasant frustration, where you want to be pushing people along and give them enough of a challenge where they're able to move forward and feel like they're indeed challenged, just not only be heavily engaged. So the question often comes to, well, how do we find out what our students know? And for all of the classes that I teach, I always give a pretest of some sort. The survey, often quite heavy in what's going to take place in the first few weeks of the semester, I ask some content questions just to kind of get a sense of, do they have some sense of knowledge about where we're beginning? And if most students are getting everything right, then sometimes that's my schedule a bit or do different types of activities in class rather than maybe depending so much on lecture. I can start out the first few weeks doing a lot of engagement activities like case-based learning or problem-based learning. Since they already know the content, let's really sort of push their ability to use those skills. Students know and teach accordingly. Principle of learning. The principle that I would share is this idea of processing. Processing of learning material tends to result in greater learning gains. So basically the bottom line is this concept of active learning. And there was an extensive amount of research done regarding active versus passive learning really back in the 80s and 90s, and that research question has really been answered with a high degree of confidence. They know that students tend to remember things and know how to apply things if they have a chance to actually do stuff with the content. You think about passive learning, what are some examples of passive learning? Certainly lecturing is the one that comes to mind for a lot of folks, and then maybe reading right behind that. But also watching a demonstration or watching a movie or watching a video or a documentary, those are termed, typically seen as passive learning strategies as well. So active learning, as I work with faculty here at UGA, if someone brings a strategy to me that they're thinking about doing in their class, the thing that I always ask myself is, will the students be doing something with the content? Will they be applying it? Will they be processing it in some way? So sort of bottom line behavior for classrooms are, once students process, they learn. So I'm always thinking, am I having them grapple with the content or apply the content in some way? And I think note-taking can be an active strategy for many students, but many students it's just a process of you're just hearing what's being said. So you're really processing it. I've had experiences where I would walk back across campus after class and I would have a student or two following me and we would be in conversation. Then I would say, well, what did you think about that, the points that I made today about Vygotsky's learning theory? And I'll get this blank stare back because while they have it in their notes, I don't do anything with the content. I don't process the content. So the you see on your screen right now, it's an example of an active learning sort of output from a class I was teaching recently. I teach one of the college teaching classes here, the GRSC 7770 classes, and thinking about sort of the elements of a job search and career expectations and things like that. And I certainly done a PowerPoint where I identified all of these pieces myself, but I had the students build it. I had the students put together all of these pieces and help talk through it and help build the knowledge and share the knowledge. So retention has greatly increased as, again, that research question has been answered, that we do know students learn more, learn better, learn more deeply through active learning strategies. Truth about learning is that learning is often facilitated by social interaction. So group learning is certainly opportunities for people to talk to one another is really a good idea. There's a sort of theory out there that's called constructivism or social constructivism that was posited by a Russian psychologist named Vygotsky. And probably his cornerstone, I guess, notable concept is something he termed the zone of proximal development. Kind of imagine two bar graphs side by side apart. And the argument is students can achieve up to a certain point by themselves. Who work with peer who may have a similar understanding, but certainly would have differences in understanding, and they could bounce ideas off of each other, they could achieve even higher. So the second bar graph would be higher than the first bar graph. Not that complete mastery or understanding all on their own or just in a short amount of time, but they certainly can achieve more. They can just really go to their heights. It might be one metaphor to kind of sort of wrap your head around. Another concept that was termed obuchini, and I really like this. It's sort of a romantic idea of teaching and learning, but he describes students growing into the intellectual life of the students around them, so around them, of the peers around them, which you think about, again, this idea of zone of proximal development, being able to achieve a certain level by self, but by working with others, you can go to greater heights, you can have greater understanding, you can do more, develop more. next to share regarding how people learn. A long line of literature really starting around 1973 focusing on the concept of learning styles. About 6 or 7 years ago, sort of a blue ribbon panel of educational psychologists and psychologists got together to kind of examine the breadth of the literature regarding learning styles. There's about 30 or 35 years worth of learning styles literature at that point. And the presentation that I have on the screen is this study. Found by looking at sort of this lineage regarding learning styles. And real quick, learning styles, the story kind of goes like this. You've got different types of learners. You've got people who learn better through visuals, and then there are people who learn better through hearing or through auditory, and then you've got people who learn better through kinetics by actually doing hands-on stuff. So, hearing might just be listening to a lecture. Visual learners would learn better if they had videos to watch or if there were graphs for them to process. Aesthetic learners might learn better in a lab setting, like in a chemistry lab or something like that. So that's the theory. And there seems to be some sort of colloquial wisdom in that people might learn differently. But what research shows regarding learning styles is there's just no evidence to support that concept, that are different kinds of learners along those modalities, how they actually learn. And visual learners, and we're all auditory learners. And I think the value of sort of learning styles is that it helps people think about what kind of learners they actually are. So it's of metacognition. How does one learn best? But what we're really finding is that the output is that it enables a lot of people to push back whenever they have taken a test of some sort that has placed them as a certain kind of learner. But, I'm a visual learner, and this person lectures all the time, and that's why I can't learn. There's actually just no evidence to support that notion of learning styles. And just sort of an anecdote from my own experience, my kids, I moved down from Virginia about a year ago. My kids, in third grade, they both were had to take a learning styles inventory test. And so Carter came home from school one Tuesday and said, "Hey, Dad, guess what? I'm a visual learner." And so I told him a bit about what that might mean. And the weekend came along, and I asked him, the trash was going to be taken on Monday, and I said, "It's your turn this week to get the trash." Later I realized he hadn't done it yet, and I asked him again, and he still hadn't done it, so I actually got 2 chairs, and I sat down with him, and I said, "What can I do to help you to the trash?" And he said, "Well, I'm a visual learner, so maybe my brother do it, and I could watch him do it, then remember to do it." So that's for him. In fact, my oldest son, whenever he took the learning styles inventory, he was told that he had even scores across all of the modalities. And so the teacher said he had no excuse. Since he lost all, he can't blame being a visual learner or an auditory learner. So that's kind of the downside to learning styles as it's been applied. And I think one reason why learning styles is so popular is that there's really a publishing industry behind learning styles. You can purchase books and purchase exams and things like that to do learning style inventories. Again, just the bottom line is no evidence that supports people learn better one way over the other. Now, that's not to say that there aren't specific learning outcomes that people might learn better one way over the other. So let's say you and I had never played tennis in our lives. And so someone gave a 30-minute hands-on lesson, and so you a book of tennis. I had a week to study the book, and I had one 30-minute lesson. I bet I could beat you, because the learning outcome was to be performed, and the fact that I actually got to practice it would suggest that I would do better at that than if I just simply studied and looked at pictures of how to a racket and swing a racket and the like. Down to this idea of someone to be able to do what's the learning outcome, and that should dictate what modality you might use, whether or not you do something hands-on, whether or not you do something via lecture, whether or not you do something with graphs and charts and video or other visuals. Okay, so kind of a point about learning styles, but definitely do go check out this article about learning styles. Now that people don't have, or college students don't have learning preferences, I think they'll have learning preferences that we can identify that you might even term one's own learning style. Not that we learn better that way, but that we prefer to learn that way. So, for instance, I'm a sojourner as a learner. It's like I'd like to kind of have my own research questions, and then like I'll go on the web or go to journals and I'll do my own research and I'll learn that way. I kind of prefer to be sort of, but I believe that I probably learn best in group settings. Of course, things that take place in group settings that make learning not very attractive. So as a good example is like this graph. Maybe some of you have seen this. This has kind of made the rounds on the internet. But what group projects are supposed to teach you, and then you've got teamwork as one of the key pieces here, and communication, responsibility, and collaboration. But group projects actually teach people, or sometimes teach people, is trust no one. My Liam, he had a project he was doing with other kids at school 4 Sundays back, and I picked him up afterwards. Hey, how did it go?
Yeah.
And the first thing he said was, I hate group projects. I think a lot of us have been in positions where either we're the ones who kind of have the responsibility for everything, or we feel like we're doing more work than others. So I think as we apply group projects, there's a lot of work that faculty and teachers need to do to make sure that group projects work for everyone involved. People have learning preferences, but not necessarily learning styles. So, I mean, it's the kind of thing that you could, again, ask in a survey at the beginning of the semester. Do you prefer to work in groups? Do you prefer to use technology? Do you prefer not to use technology? That kind of stuff can feed into some of the pedagogical choices one might make in a class. The idea of feedback and its role in the learning process. And what we know is that performance by really immediate feedback increases learning. I was just speaking with a faculty this morning who has students do all kinds of assignments. I mean, it's really a labor-intensive course, but because the students do so much writing and do so many projects, he doesn't have the time to grade or provide feedback. Students are doing things, but they don't know if they're doing it right. So they're kind of left in this loop of not really having that loop closed. They know that they're doing stuff and they're getting some practice at it, but they might be practicing it wrong. So performance is a key piece here, where you actually have students do something, but they need to receive feedback regarding that. And of course, I think one of the key pieces is immediate. You know, if you take up papers and you don't come back for 3 weeks, when the students get the papers back, they really won't have any very much recall regarding what they had written. They'll probably just be looking for a summative grade. But if they turn in something on a Tuesday, and if they're able to get it back on Thursday, they're able to engage and look at what they missed and better understand, and more likely correct their own understanding of things that they missed. So followed by immediate feedback increases learning. We empirically influences what we might be doing in the classroom. Models for kind of calculating human attention spans, and it's estimated that maybe around the age of 4 or 5 you have an attention span that can last maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and then for every year you can add another 3 minutes to an attention span, but get to be into double digits into your teens and into adulthood, the average attention span typically maxes out at around 20 minutes. When you look at TED Talks, that's why TED Talks are limited to 18 minutes or less, is because they know how long incredibly engaging talk about the length that people can be engaged. Now, with TED, when you look at the typical classes at university settings, you've got the 50-minute class, the 75-minute class. I'm currently teaching a class that meets for 3 hours on Wednesdays. So we've got attention spans that max out at 20 minutes, and then I've got 3 hours to teach, and even if it's just 50 minutes. So there's studies out there that suggest paths forward for how do we approach teaching a population whose attention span maxes out at around 20 minutes. And one example came from some studies in the 80s, and it was called pause procedure. The strategy is called the pause procedure. Pause procedure, you lecture, your 20, 25 minutes, and halfway through a 50-minute class you stop and you say, okay, everyone, I'm really fast for the last 25 minutes. What I want you to do is look at your notes and silently take 2 minutes and read your notes and fill in the blanks and draw arrows to concepts that are connected. You couldn't note everything that I said, so read back over silently right now, and I want to see everyone's pens moving over the next 2 minutes just to read what I said. So on your mark, get set, go. What they find is if you give students 2 minutes in the middle of class to, number one, they're processing their content. So back to the idea of what we process, we learn. They're forced to process their notes, so that's one thing that's taking place. Also, it's an opportunity to do something different. It breaks that or resets that attention span cycle. So what the research shows is that students who have 2 minutes in the middle of a lecture class to revisit their notes and make some changes perform statistically significantly better on tests than students who are just sort of sitting through the same content, just a straight 50-minute lecture without the 2-minute break to do something else. Ramifications for really everything, almost every college class in higher education. Yeah. People tend to remember things that are delivered in a novel fashion. By novel, I mean unique, something that's done differently that hasn't happened in class before. So it's the novelty effect. That if there's something delivered uniquely, you're more likely to remember it. And so, for example, I can remember where I was maybe 2 years ago now when I saw first Prezi presentation. Just really amazed, like, wow, we're going through letter O. Wow, look at all that text I couldn't see before. It's really interesting and exciting, and I can even tell you what the topic was of that first presentation. Now, there's certainly some distraction around novelty, but if the novelty is tied to the instructional strategy, and to the content, it often can prove beneficial to the learning process. As an example, this Prezi presentation that's up in front of you, it's you can see the snowball teaching strategy. And snowball teaching strategy, it goes something like this. You would have students get out a piece of paper, and you might ask them to summarize the class, or you have seen over the weekend, write down the 3 most important points that you can recall from that reading. So 3 things. Have them take that piece of paper and they ball it up until that piece of paper, and then you throw the piece of paper to another student in the class. So you've got pain everywhere for a few seconds, and then students to unroll that piece of wadded up paper and read the 3 things that are there, and then add 3 more things. So you've got these points that someone else noted. What are some other things? And it's if you repeat things that you said before, but you 3 things, and then you wipe and throw it again, and then maybe you add 3 more things, and then maybe you do it a 4th time, depending on how much class time you want to take up. But it's that you're kind of throwing the paper around. You're also requiring processing, which is really good. Again, what we process, we learn. So you kind of find strategies there, and it will increase retention. It's also a great thing to do in the middle of class to break attention spans. So a lot of these things have overlapping effects and impacts. So the next concept of the digital native. The narrative around digital natives really began around, there were 3 that kind of noted some key things between 1998 and 2001. And the story goes something like this. All born blank slates, so we're shaped by our experiences. And the argument is that every generation, pre our current generation, every generation was shaped by the primary influencers would have been parents, school, siblings, community, church. We could probably make a few more things there. Is that today's students, today's college students, have been heavily influenced by technology more than anything else out there. And as such, they've developed new skills and traits and the like that enable them to do things differently or uniquely that previous generations could not do. So one of the myths around today's digital natives is that they have fantastic computer skills, that you just drop in any technology in a classroom and they're going to figure it out because they've had so much practice figuring out technologies. And practice is a key about people being able to I mean, certainly if you've got a population of students who may have logged hundreds of hours in Facebook, they probably have a high degree of Facebook expertise, and they're really good at Facebook. But if you drop them into a stat class and they're asked to use SAS or SPSS, you know, 1,000 of Facebook isn't really going to help them at all with their do things with SAS or SPSS or another statistical software package. So one thing native doesn't even take into account is the idea of socioeconomic variables. No one even has access to the latest, greatest tools. So, you know, access to technology is on a bell curve where there's certainly some that are more affluent that might have the newest iPhone every time it comes out, but there's many others who have phones that aren't even smartphones. So it's largely myth. Most of the components have been broken down. And one of the key elements regarding digital native conceptions is this idea of today's students as multitaskers. And really what research shows is that successful multitasking, really when two tasks require cognitive attention, it's just simply not possible. So there was kind of research in the late 1800s that kind of exhausted itself by 1950, and it was focusing on dual task processing. At all age groups, all economic class, all ethnicity, gender, all of those variables. And what they basically found was humans really can't do two things at the same time. We just can't do it. And that line of research kind of died out. We had answered that research question. The whole digital native narrative, it kind of renewed this interest in this concept of multitasking because there's anecdotal evidence that we see today's students multitasking. We see them texting and walking. We see a lot of people texting and driving these days. There's I guess, opportunities to attempt to actually multitask. But there's been a number of studies that have looked at multitasking, and what we find is if both tasks require cognitive attention, it's not possible to multitask. So as an example of things that multitasking, when it is somewhat possible, is like you could walk across campus, and while walking, we have an intellectual conversation. And it's because we've automated the task of walking so much from years and years of practice that it take a lot of attention. However, we have someone walking toward us who maybe their head's down and they're texting and you're having a conversation, you certainly stop the conversation to adjust because now you have to give the task of walking some attention. And we have little stories like that. It's like, you know, if you're listening to music and you're driving into Atlanta and your exit's getting close, what's the first thing that you do as you approach the exit? You put down that you can focus on the exit. What has research shown us about multitasking, and really specifically in the learning context? Well, there was a release just earlier this year. It's cited here. It's the SANA citation. It looked at, well, it essentially initially at two groups of people. They gave students a list of things that they should do during class on their laptop, and they can do these things anytime they'd like. Check a ball score, check your email, post something in Facebook. It was just a handful of things that students were asked to do. And then students who were the non-multitaskers. And what they found was those who were multitasking, those who were not multitasking, taskers performed a full letter grade lower, 11% lower on the end-of-class test than the non-multitaskers. So certain who were randomly assigned the task of multitasking were distracted. But the next graph I want to show you, I think, is even more interesting. They had another group, and the group of non-multitaskers, they divided it into two groups. Multitaskers who could see the screens, wait, that again, the multitaskers who the screens of the multitaskers. The non-multitaskers who view of the screens of the multitaskers. And it was non-multitaskers who could simply see the screens of the tasking performed 2 grades lower than those who were non-multitasking and had no view of the screen. So this is, as a student, a student who is really trying to stay on task probably should find a place to sit in the class where they can't see the screens of other students. Immersive of classroom practices for faculty, whether or not those who want to use laptops should be in one side of the room or sitting in the back or sitting in the corner, so they're not distracting everyone else. But really, why there is such a big difference here was a 17% difference between the two non-multitasking groups. And one multitasking, you get the choice of deciding whether or not you are going to multitask and when. So in other words, okay, I want to check out, it's March Madness is going on, there's ball games in the middle of the day, I want to check out a ball. Okay, I'm going to wait till the professor switches slides. Okay, choose whenever I drop out of class and when I come back into class, whenever I switch out and switch in with my multitasking behaviors. Are not multitasking but are in view of the screen don't get a choice. So there's just this distraction. They see the screen change, the visual on the page changes and your eyes drawn to it, and then you try to process it and make sense of what you're seeing. It requires more cognitive load to view a laptop over someone's shoulder than just to make the choices yourself about when you drop in and drop out as you multitask. And really around multitaskers, it sort of breaks down along 2 lines, is that today's students are effective multitaskers, so it's okay that they use a lot of technology in classroom. It's okay if they set up to be distracted. And plus, they're excellent at the use of technology in general. And there's lots of data out there that's showing both of those positions to be untrue, to just be myths. Okay. Number 10, what was self-regulation? And is that typically don't become fully self-regulated. Basically, the frontal lobe isn't fully developed until around the age of 25. So the right choice for the average undergraduate isn't necessarily exceptionally easy. I mean, you're drawn to do another task, you self-regulate to know this isn't the best time to do this, or I should wait till the end of class to check my email or to look at the text that buzz in my pocket. And so you start thinking about sort of the experience of what it is to be a teenager these days. And an example maybe, imagine that you just graduated from high school. It's the day after graduation and you're having breakfast, and then your phone buzzes in your pocket, and it's a friend, hey, let's meet at the lake. And then the rest of the day you get, what might be the number of texts that the average high school senior or high school graduate receives, around the age of 17 or 18. It could be 50 a day, but let's say 20. So 20 times that first day after you get from high school, your phone buzzes in your pocket. You take it out and you look at it, and then you put it back in, and you get this sort of response with a little social reward every time you check your text messages. A friend who's letting me know about something. Someone's inviting me to do something. I'm going to meet someone there. But then for the next 9 days after graduating from high school, 20 times a day over 9 days, you get this sort of Pavlovian treatment where you get a bell in your pocket, and then you get a positive reinforcement by the messages that you see. It happens for 90 days, and then you do your first large lecture class in college, and professors going over the syllabus, and your phone buzzes in your pocket. What do you? And again, you're 17 years old, so you're 8 years prior to being fully self-regulating, and you've had this intense stimulus response treatment all summer long leading up to your time going to college. It's just really not surprising that we see students doing so much extracurricular multitasking with the technologies. So that's suggestive of probably classroom management strategies that the faculty member should institute to help students self-regulate appropriately. An example, it might be you've got a group activity planned in class, and as you lecture for 15 or 20 minutes and then you switch to the group activity, you might kick off the activity by saying, okay, this next thing that we're going to do is not going to require any technology, so go ahead and put your phones in your pocket and close up your laptops because we're going to be doing something else, and I need 100% of your attention. That's, I think, the new reality that we're working in higher education. That classroom management is becoming increasingly important to help students make the appropriate choices given what we know about self-regulation and multitasking and the like. My last item here is sort of my bonus item. What do we know about students' preferences for learning? So I'm going to increase this graph and talk a little bit about it. There's a group called EDUCAUSE that does research regarding technology in higher education. And they do a survey every year, actually. But the survey results that I'm sharing with you at the moment is from 2 years ago. So the results were released, this was done spring 2012, and the results released in fall 2012. What they did is they gave students, in response, they had about 106,000 college students respond. They were freshmen and seniors. So those in Canada and the U.S. from lots of different institutions, including the University of Georgia. What they did is they gave them a list of technologies that often used to teach and to communicate with students. So you've got the learning management system, you've got email, text messaging, Facebook, Twitter, all of those various things. Green bars that you see are the percentage of students who said faculty need to use this more. The reddish maroon